We live on the cusp of one of the most important general elections in the history of our lives. In 2 weeks, one nation will elect a leader that will have lasting consequences around the world. Lasting because it will almost certainly confirm a shift in the way we understand and use words like faith, trust, believe, evidence, and narrative, especially in the West. So what does our gospel story have to do with the story of the American elections? We have traveled through John's Gospel, a gospel written that we may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. By this stage, if we've been reading John's Gospel from the start without putting it down, we'll be enthralled by this person, Jesus, who has challenged people's expectations of who the Messiah is. And then, like the pre-echo one hears when listening to a well-mixed song, the story of Lazarus rises up, pointing to the resurrection of Jesus himself. There are a few things in our passage I want to point to before coming back to the elections. First, the story starts by painting the scene, and there is a detail that is important to note. John mentions that Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. What's interesting about this is that John only tells the story of Mary anointing Jesus' feet in the next chapter. Anyone who has read John a number of times knows that he doesn't do things by mistake and that he is very, very intentional. He is not simply writing a chronological narrative account of events as they happened. He is piecing them together to draw your attention to certain events and helping you interpret them in light of others. Two things come to us when we see this information inserted here. First, we can tell that John's audience knew who Mary was, and second, she must have been fairly significant. Richard Bauckham, in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, points out how the majority of miracle stories do not have names attached to them. So when they are attached, it is almost certainly because the hearers of the stories knew who these people were, and that they played some role in the early church. The closing line from this first section, where John is setting the scene, also points to the resurrection account of Jesus. After having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. After the 2 days had passed, he suggests to his disciples that they should go to Judea, and they protest because of the Jews who were trying to stone him. Scholars of just about all schools and the tradition of the church teaches us that John's Gospel was written after the fall of the temple in 70 AD. This date is important because before 70 AD, Christians were very much seen as Jews. Even though there were disputes about Jesus as the Messiah, his followers were recognizable to those inside and outside Judaism as a part of Judaism. After the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, the differences became starker, until any hope of reconciliation was dashed after the revolt of 132 AD by a so-called Messiah, Simon ben Koziva. He was renamed by the most prominent rabbi of his time as Simon bar Kokhba, or Simon, son of the star. For obvious reasons, although Simon bar Kokhba clearly failed in his revolt against Rome, Judaism could not have two messiahs, failed or successful. This should raise questions for those with a keen ear. Why do we follow Jesus as Messiah rather than Bar Kokhba as Messiah, if they both died at the hands of the Romans? But back to the main story. The dating of the Gospel is important because we see in the earlier Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that Jesus' main opposition came from Pharisees and Sadducees, who were themselves branches of Judaism, not from all Jews. John does not include that detail when he simply uses the word Jews, because his audience was probably not that interested in those distinctions. It is difficult to tell why he uses the blanket term Jews, because Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were clearly Jews. Not all Jews wanted to stone Jesus, as the story goes on to suggest. Interestingly, it is Thomas who suggests they follow Jesus to Judea. We don't know if it's a sarcastic comment or one meant to galvanize the other disciples. John writes in a way that allows people to interpret many of his words in 2 or 3 ways. Before that, Jesus talks about Lazarus falling asleep and the disciples not understanding what he is saying. Is this just humor creeping in here? Because it certainly looks funny. But it is also very serious. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. The word cemetery comes to us from the Greek word koiman, meaning to put to sleep. It changed to koimaterion and later to cemetery in late Middle English. The Latin equivalent of cemetery is dormitory, or a place where a group of people sleep. Before cemetery was used to describe graveyards, the word necropolis was used, or city of the dead. When Jesus gets to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, he has an interaction with Martha. In some senses, John reverses the story told of the 2 sisters in Luke's Gospel. In Luke's Gospel, Mary is the devoted student learning from the Messiah, while Martha is worried about accommodating Jesus and his disciples. But in John's Gospel, Mary stays at home, while Martha rushes out to meet Jesus. In that brief interaction, we are given key insights into how the resurrection was anticipated. Most Jews believed there would be a resurrection of the dead on the day of judgment, sometimes referred to as the last day. This would happen when the Messiah was enthroned and acknowledged by all as the real Son of God. That title is important because in Rome, Caesar was also called Son of God. Anyone with ears to hear would recognize that there cannot be 2 sons of God ruling in the world at any one time. Just like you can't have 2 messiahs, you can't have 2 Caesars. But I digress. What is important here is that John is preparing his listeners for Jesus' resurrection. He shows what people believe about the resurrection, and then Jesus asks Mary if she believes that he, Jesus, is the resurrection and the life, and she responds with a confession of faith that echoes Peter's in Mark's Gospel. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Only then does Mary enter the picture, and with her we see the pain of the community through the light of different eyes. They knew Jesus could have kept Lazarus alive, and so did those who were visiting Mary and Martha. Jesus had a reputation, and you can see that people are already interpreting it in light of the way they want events to unfold. Some recognized Jesus' love for Lazarus and the family, and felt with him for the distress of Lazarus' death that had caused him and Mary and Martha. Some were more concerned with could-haves. Jesus could have done this. Jesus could have done that. Were they saying all of this pain was unnecessary? Here is perhaps the hardest lesson for Christians, and also all people. The glory comes on the far side of pain. Martha, Mary, and all resurrection-believing Jews were not expecting the Messiah to be raised from the dead because they were not expecting the Messiah to be killed. And they couldn't look at the hard facts. Lazarus was dead and people were feeling pain, and they were more concerned about what could have happened. Most of you know that I am newly a father. Carissa, our daughter, turned 2 months old this week, and already she is being used in sermon illustrations. We have been doubly blessed, first and foremost, by her birth and healthy development, but secondly, by the gifts we have received from the St. Peter's community, the St. Thomas's community, our friends and family, and even from our Toastmasters club. I don't think we are going to need clothes or serious equipment for the first 3 years of Carissa's life. But here's an interesting story. One of the bibs we received has the words, "Always happy," embroidered in it. Clearly, whoever designed this bib has never had a baby. Yes, we can confidently say Carissa is a happy baby, but she is far from always happy. Whenever her hunger rises, the way her face contorts is enough to pull on the toughest heartstrings. She is clearly not happy at these moments. Many of you will remember the early 90s song, "Shiny Happy People" by R.E.M. It's a song that ideally you don't just listen to, but first watch as a music video. Because this beautiful, happy-sounding song shows how this plastic facade we put on in the West is driven by exploitative labor behind the scenes. Other signs that matters are out of kilter with regards to happiness and sadness are changes to the American Diagnostics and Statistics Manual for Mental Disorders, or DSM for short. One of the changes that took place in the 5th edition is that the loss of a loved one is no longer seen as a valid cause for depression. Now, any of these factors could be harmless in and of themselves, but when taken together, we can see a pattern developing that excludes grief and sadness as normal and valid expressions of pain and discomfort. We are instructed by the narrative that is repeated in many subtle and not so subtle messages throughout media and well-meaning friends, that if we are not happy, we are not whole. In reality, those who have cut themselves off from feeling pain and sadness present in reality have severed a part of themselves, and the capacity to love has been diminished. When we follow the story in the Gospel a bit further, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and the words are instructive. Jesus instructs people to unbind Lazarus from the clothes that held him in death. This is in marked contrast to how Jesus is freed from his own grave clothes. He doesn't need other humans to do this for him. And our passage ends with the encouraging sign that many Jews believe in him because of how he raised Lazarus from the dead. But the story doesn't end there. Immediately, some of the Jews report him to the Pharisees and chief priests, and they in turn start plotting to kill him. They even admit that he is performing signs, and yet they refuse to believe. It is in this light that I want to come back to the elections in the United States. You see, if you don't want to believe things, it doesn't matter what evidence you are presented with. You will find a reason not to believe. As the psychologist Leon Festinger said, a man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree, and he turns away. Show him facts or figures, and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic, and he fails to see your point. When we look at the candidates in the presidential election, we see someone who refuses to acknowledge reality and calls credible evidence presented to him fake news. He tear gasses people so that he can go to church and hold a Bible so that photos can be taken of him. He openly backs conspiracy theory platforms and militant groups and refuses to acknowledge the seriousness of COVID-19. When you compare that candidate with the temple authorities in Jesus' day, you find that when reality confronts them, they refuse to change their narrative and will rather plot to kill Jesus or jail their opponents on, pun intended, trumped-up charges. May I suggest to you, in the words of Fyodor Dostoevsky, that the shiny happy people narrative goes along with the lies and the inability to mourn with those who mourn. We face a challenge in our society today of a magnitude much greater than most are willing to acknowledge. Where you sit in relation to Donald Trump is a remarkably good indicator of where you sit in relation to the temple authorities of Jesus' day. Above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point that he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses all respect for himself and for others. And having no respect, he ceases to love.